I'm here with Robert Skidelsky, Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at Warwick University. Robert, thank you for joining us. I thought we would start by discussing your role at the conference this year, what you were discussing, and we can go on from there.
Well, I was discussing with two other panelists the state of economics and what was wrong with it and its relationship to power in particular, which is an ignored subject. Normally we talk about economic theories and whether they're right or wrong and their weaknesses and strengths, but we very rarely consider their relationship to interests, and that this might actually determine the kind of theories that are being produced and win acceptance.
I was speaking to a mathematician before, and we discussed this very subject, and I said economists like to have this conceit that somehow it's a science devoid of political values, and I said that's really as absurd as speaking about mathematics without numbers.
Yeah, well, of course, I think that is the conceit. In a way, economists have to believe this. They have to believe that they're being scientific and that they're not just hired guns. And mostly they're not just hired guns, but nevertheless, if you look at the history of economics and the way it's changed in response to changes in many things, but including changes in the power structure, you do find that the ideas that come to dominate economics generally serve the interests of the power holders. At the moment, they are the financial power.
And in what respect would you say that's different from, you as the leading biographer of Keynes, in what respect would you say it's different from, say, his period?
Well, he didn't believe that. I mean, he believed, as his fellow economists did, that he was in the search for truth and he was providing better theories than the previous generation. But then when you, and I think most economists do actually believe that. There are a few hired guns, actually, but most economists are quite altruistic. But then when you ask the question, what were the conditions under which his theories could succeed, then you are in the realm of politics, and you have a certain balance of power. In the business leaders couldn't suppress workers in the way they had done in the 19th century. Unions were becoming more powerful, and then of course there was a huge crisis of capitalism going on with communism. So in those circumstances, a sort of middle way in which government, business and trade unions balanced each other was a good compromise, and Keynesian theory was the philosophy of the middle way.
And of course, you had a situation where when you've got 20–25% unemployment and the political class or the dominant economic class is so politically discredited, then you have the opportunity to introduce real reforms. Ironically, today, after the great financial recession, because we have the existence of these automatic stabilizers, which is of course the great legacy of Keynesianism, we never got to a situation where we got to Great Depression 2, and maybe the great paradox of that is because of that we didn't get the kinds of reforms, the New Deal style reforms that might have actually created the conditions for a more sustainable prosperity.
I think that's right. The shock was never deep enough to shake the discipline to its foundations, or indeed to shake policy to its foundations. And what happened, of course, was the Keynesian revolution came and went, and you had the conservative counter-revolution, and now that's discredited. But Keynesianism isn't rehabilitated. We are looking around for a new paradigm. And it's not clear where the political power is drifting, to where it's drifting. Finance is still very, very dominant. And if you look at something like quantitative easing, it's really a way of it's a way of placating the financial system by increasing wealth, the wealth of people who already have a lot of wealth. So they come out as winners from this sort of remedy for the crisis. And what we're not doing is actually not what is not happening is that the governments are being allowed to increase their borrowing, because that's regarded as fatal for confidence. So the whole choices that are now taking place between fiscal and monetary policy are being determined by the interests that are powerful.
And there's this ideological bias against the use of fiscal policy. I mean, monetary policy has been elevated to the extent where fiscal policy is not used at all. And so in many respects, it seems to me that you've got tools like quantitative easing which are being used, and most people will explicitly say that it's being designed to promote a greater use of the risk assets, or promote the riskier assets. And instead of using fiscal policy to try to generate full employment, higher incomes, higher employment, which would have been more of a Keynesian.
Yeah, you see, there seems to be a veto on fiscal policy, and they say, well, the bond markets won't allow it, and that is the orthodoxy. Austerity is the orthodoxy. But at the same time, there's common sense. Unfortunately, most politicians aren't entirely devoid of common sense, unlike many economists. And therefore, they realise they've got to do something. And quantitative easing offers a promise, but we're about to test it, I think, pretty much to destruction. Its results so far have been quite mediocre. There's been a lot of money being printed, but where is it? A lot of it has stayed in the banks, and that's explained because the banks had to deleverage. But the transmission mechanisms were pretty faulty. But the group that has benefited from quantitative easing are people who owned assets and who have seen their assets increase enormously in value.
The transmission mechanisms are faulty in part because, of course, when you introduce credit, it's a two-way process between borrower and lender. And if the borrower is not creditworthy, then obviously he's not going to receive the loan. And to be creditworthy, you've got to have a job, have employment, have higher incomes.
And also to borrow to invest, you've got to see a market. You've got to see, you know, you have to have an expectation of profit. And the expectation of profit depends very largely on whether you think you're going to have an expanding market for your products. It doesn't entirely depend on that, but that's a very crucial component. If you don't see that, if you see a shrinking market, you're not going to invest. If you're not going to invest, you're not going to borrow. And so it's both a supply of credit problem and a demand for credit problem. And quantitative easing remedies all emphasize, they just concentrate on the supply of credit and ignore the demand. We have a problem of deficient aggregate demand, full stop. And that's the thing that's got to be addressed.
And that's and it goes beyond quantitative easing. The constant refrain one hears in Europe is we need more supply side structural reforms. And as you say, it's fundamentally a problem of demand. In fact, you could make the case that a supply side reform in the context of a weakening economy doesn't actually work. In fact, it makes things worse.
Yeah, it doesn't. It simply doesn't work. And there's a subtle relationship, by the way, between demand and supply. The longer you leave unemployment and allow unemployment and unemployed resources to continue, the more you diminish supply. Because what you're doing is you're actually destroying not only physical capital but human capital.
Long-term degradation.
Yeah,
and that's where the real waste comes in. People like to talk about the government waste, but actually the greatest waste of all is long-term unemployment.
Huge waste. I always say, although people don't get the point really, I say, all right, let's assume that there's a lot of government waste. In anything the government does, let's assume that 75% is wasted. But still, that's better than 100% being wasted.
Which I think is the main point. That it's a very misquoted line. The comment that Keynes made about digging up holes and then putting the dirt back in the ground. And of course, that's been used to ridicule Keynesian-style policies. But in fact, I think Keynes was making a broadly similar point to the one you were making.
Yes, and he also said in that quote, the bit that's never usually quoted is if governments can't think of anything else. Well, he thought there were many other things you could think about. And infrastructure is obvious. Investment in public utilities. I mean, you have a huge backlog. Do you know that in Britain, the government cancelled all its capital programs, virtually all its capital programs in 2009, 2010. These weren't programs that had to have 5 years or 10 years of gestation. They were shovel-ready programs. They were ready to go. They were in the program already. Schools, hospitals, housing, roads, railways, they were all there, cancelled.
Because they believed in the confidence fairy. They thought that somehow the bond market.
We've got to cut our spending, and of course, the easiest thing to do when you're cutting your spending is to cut your capital programs, because you don't actually cut any spending. It hasn't yet started. It's just committed. Whereas if you try to cut current spending, you're actually cutting spending that's going on at the moment.
In fact, for all, one could criticize the Blair-Brown administration for their accommodation of the growth of financial services and the so-called soft touch, soft regulatory touch that Gordon Brown used to extol to his European colleagues. But I thought the response of the Brown-Darling team post the onset of the crisis was one of the best and most cohesive. And in many respects, it's a classic Keynesian response. You allow the fiscal deficit to get large enough to put a floor.
That's the automatic stabilizer.
The stabilizers come into effect. Sterling was allowed to go, so you minimize the shock to the external sector, and therefore unemployment I think never got higher than 7.5%, despite and also effectively nationalizing large chunks of the industry, so you could break it up. But tragically, that policy wasn't continued by the Cameron administration.
Well, I think you're right, and the inside story of the last year of Brown-Darling hasn't been written properly. I mean, what it'll reveal, though, is a big build-up of tension between the Treasury and Brown. I mean, the Treasury said, look, you've got to take the deficit seriously. And Brown's view was, you have to concentrate on unemployment and the state of the economy. Now, how serious a clash that was, I don't know. I think it was pretty serious.
It's very evocative, though, of the same debate we had in the 1930s.
Very evocative. And in fact, Brown used to go around number 10, raging away, as you know, he was sort of, half the time they say he was out of control. I don't know whether that, I will not be another Philip Snowden, he kept saying. So there was, he didn't want to go as fast as Darling in reduction. Darling felt he had to do as much as he did do, which is to have a deficit reduction plan stretching over a longer period than the Cameron Osborne one, to placate the markets. And then when Osborne comes in, it coincides with the Greek crisis, and he has a perfect excuse for doing something he wanted to do for ideological reasons, by saying, unless we do what I'm saying, we will go the way of Greece. The cost of our debt will shoot up to 8%, and we'll be bankrupt.
And we'll lose our AAA rating, which
lose our AAA rating
anyway,
which happened anyway.
And it was a fundamentally dishonest analogy because, as you well know, I mean, Greece is in its position, like all the other countries in the European Monetary Union. They've effectively ceded their fiscal sovereignty. They borrow de facto in a foreign currency because the ECB issues the currency, whereas Britain, like the US, remains a fully sovereign country and has full fiscal freedom. And yet this myth has been peddled that we're going to be like Greece unless we embrace this fiscal austerity. And the irony, of course, is that the public debt to GDP ratio has been going up again.
The public debt to GDP ratio has been going up, and by this time it was meant to be leveling off. The deficit has been cut a little bit, but not by much, and some of it by accounting, changing certain accounting conventions, which always enables you to put a better face on it than is true in reality, and that's just because the policy has reduced government revenues more than it's cutting its spending. So it's like a cat chasing its own tail.
Well, it's the old fallacy of composition.
It's the old fallacy of composition.
And on that great Keynesian insight, we will have to stop the interview. But again, thank you very much for taking the time, sharing your insights as always. It's greatly appreciated by everyone. Thank you, Robert.
Great pleasure to be on and be talking to you.